If you have a Bible with you this morning, I invite you to open up to Hebrews chapter 9. If you're looking at one of the in-house Bibles in the seat back in front of you, it's page 1210 in that Bible. We're going to be in Hebrews 9, bouncing around quite a bit between verses 5 and 28 in that passage. And so the words and verses will also be on the screen behind me, but we'll be in Hebrews 9 in just a moment. So with 3 young kids in the Marvel house, evenings are a lot of work. And we say that the hours between 5:30 and 7:30 are all hands on deck. It takes everybody in the family working together to make those 2 hours work because there's a lot to do between getting kids fed for dinner, getting homework done, getting them in the bath to get them clean, and then actually getting them in their bed. And so if I ever schedule a meeting during that time, Becky gives me this look of death, like, you better find a way to change that meeting and be home by 5:30, you understand? Because there's just a lot that goes into those 2 hours in our home. But one of the things that we have found that helps the evening go smoothly is bath time, specifically for Lucy, because we're at this point with our older 2 kids where there's homework every night that they have to do, and they're not always excited about doing their homework, so we sit down with them at the table and try and focus and help them. But Lucy doesn't have homework, and she just wants to play, and she just wants to get in the midst of everything that we're doing. So we said, hey, let's go start a bath for Lucy. Lucy loves baths. She can go play. She's at that age where we no longer have to watch her like a hawk as she gets in the tub. So we can just let her play, help the other kids, and then get up with her later. And so while she's playing, we're doing homework with the kids, and then she's usually really content, but when it comes time to getting her out of the tub, that's when it starts to get a little tricky because she doesn't want to get out of the tub. Right? She wants to keep playing with her Barbies and her toys, and so lately I've devised a new game to help clean her up. And it's just a copycat game. I stand on the outside of the tub, she stands in the tub, and we have one of those like pink loofah things. It's like a sponge, and it gets all soapy, and we get that soaped up, and I have her copy me the actions that I'm doing and tell her to say, hey, Lucy, wash your arm like this, and then she'll do it real excitedly, and wash your arm like this. She loves washing her backside. She thinks that's really funny. And then she'll do it to me. She's like, Dad, you do this. And then we get soap in her hair. And so she's like white from head to toe, right? Because she's got all this soap and suds all over her. And she loves that part. But then it comes time to rinsing her off. And she's not as crazy about that part. Why? Because she's afraid she's going to get soap in her eyes. She's terrified of that. And so sit her in the tub. And I try and tell her, lean your head back. And I'm also trying to teach her how to do this on her own, to do it by herself, so I don't need to be the one who does it for her all the time. So tip your head back, cover something, use a cup, and we're working it and trying to do it, and she gets frustrated with me. And the other day this week, she just looked at me and said, Dad, I can't do it, Dad. And so then I had to go and do it for her. And I tell you this story because all throughout the scriptures, this imagery of being clean, we live lives that have been stained and are marked and dirty, but yet there's the possibility of being clean. And we can become clean, but the truth is we can't clean ourselves. Just like Lucy says, I can't do it. We too have to say those same words when it comes to being clean. You see this metaphor and this imagery all over the scriptures. If you were to go to Psalm 51, verse 7, David writes, cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. But David here is speaking to God in this moment, saying, Lord, you have to do it. You have to be the one to wash me. You have to be the one who cleanses me because I can't do it on my own. This fall, we've been studying through the book of Hebrews, and we've been titling this series, Jesus is Better. And it's a letter, the book of Hebrews is a letter written to a group of Jewish Christians who have made a decision somewhere along the way to follow Jesus, but now in their newfound faith, they are hitting hard times, they are hitting persecution, and they're contemplating going back to their old ways. They're contemplating going back to their Jewish roots, and the writer is writing to them to say, stay the course, don't quit, don't give up, don't go back. Why? Because Jesus is better. The strategy of this letter is to go after all of these things that are uniquely Jewish from the Old Testament and show how Jesus, also being a Jew, fulfills these things. He is the capstone and the climax of these things. So why go back to the old way of things? Keep going forward because Jesus is the fulfillment and Jesus is better. And so today in chapter 9, we come to the most significant symbol of all the Jewish symbols, the temple, and the sacrifices that took place in the temple. And the writer today is essentially saying Jesus is a better temple and at the same time, a better sacrifice. And so what I want to do this morning is work through this passage looking at one main idea, and it's this. My sermon in one sentence is that it's only Jesus who makes us clean. It's only Jesus who can make us truly clean. And I want to work through this passage looking at three things. One, how we become clean. Two, some warnings that the writer gives in being clean. And then three, actually believing that you're clean. So, how we become clean, warnings in being clean, and then actually believing that you are clean. And our big idea is that it's only Jesus who makes us truly clean. And so in just a minute, we'll be bouncing around through different passages. We'll kind of look through them as we go instead of reading it all from up front. But let's go ahead and jump in and look at how we become clean. Now, when it comes to understanding this section of the letter, it's helpful to have the larger outline of what has happened before this point in the book of Hebrews. Because all along the way, the writer of Hebrews has been building on all of his Old Testament metaphors with each chapter and with each section. So if you remember back to the beginning of the series, we looked at chapters 1 and 2 and talked about how Jesus is better than angels. And then in chapters 3 and 4, the writer moves to talk about Moses and how Jesus is better than Moses. And the significance of Moses is that he leads the people from slavery in Egypt into the promised land. And this is the moment in Israel's history where their identity is starting to be solidified. They are chosen people, called by God to be his people. It's also in this season of their history during the Exodus when God gives the people the law. God gives them the sacrifices. He gives them also the temple as a place to worship him and where his presence will dwell among them. Their identity as God's people starts to take shape during the story of Moses. But the writer is saying, and Jesus is superior to Moses. He's better than Moses. And then once you hit chapter 5 through 8, he starts to talk about the high priest, the specific role of the high priest. And then in chapter 9 and 10, he talks about the temple and the ministry of the high priest in the temple. And so in talking about the temple, which this whole passage is about, it's helpful to have some visual of how the temple was laid out in order to really grasp what he's saying here. And so we have this picture, this rendering of what's called Solomon's temple, which is the Old Testament temple. And the reason it's called Solomon's temple is because he was the guy who was king of Israel at the time when the temple was built. And what you'll see on the outside of this temple is like this patio area, and that's known as the inner court. And so you'll see this yellow line appears around that rectangle, and you have to use your imagination a little bit that there would be these huge walls coming up that surround that patio area, making that an inner court. So that assumes if there's an inner court, there's also an outer court. So there's this green dotted line, which you have to use your imagination, also would be this massive wall that comes up there that separates the outer court from the rest of the city. And so you would have an outer court, an inner court, and then inside the inner court was the actual temple itself. And the temple was divided into two parts. There was the holy place, which is shown by this red circle, and then there would have been the most holy place, shown by the blue circle, and there was this massive veil that divided the two spaces. And so this is how the temple was laid out. For those who prefer a bird's eye view of the layout, we have this picture as well. You see the yellow lines being the outer or the inner court, the green being the outer court, and then you have these two spots. And you'll notice at the entrance of the inner court is an altar. And so how this would work is if somebody were coming to the temple to offer a sacrifice, they would enter into the inner court, they would meet a priest, and they would do their sacrifices in the inner court at the altar. But what the writer is talking about here isn't so much the sacrifices that the people would bring, but the work and the ministry that the priest would do inside the temple. It was only the priests who were allowed in the temple, and it was only the high priest who was allowed in the most holy place in the temple. And he was only allowed to go in once a year. And so in chapter 9, the first 5 verses set up some of the layout of how the temple was structured. But then in verse 6 is when the writer starts talking about the ministry of the priests. And he says this, chapter 9, verse 6, "When everything had been arranged like this, the priest entered regularly into the outer room, which should have been the holy place, to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance." And so the high priest was the only one who entered into the most holy of places. It was thought that God's presence dwelled in that place, and he was only allowed once a year. The one time a year he was allowed to go in was called the Day of Atonement. It was a significant day for the Israelites because it was like the sacrifice. There was all of these sacrifices that the Israelites would bring to the temple. There were 5 different types of sacrifices. Some were voluntary, some were mandatory. There's all sorts of different sacrifices. But this one sacrifice was the sacrifice that essentially cleared the people of their sin. And the high priest only did it once a year, and there are very specific instructions. You can go to Leviticus 16 and read how this was supposed to go. It was a big deal because the high priest was to be in seclusion for a week before he entered in. He had to take a special bath. He had to put on special clothes. He had to bring a bull that he would sacrifice just for himself to cleanse himself before he goes in. Then he would bring 2 goats, one that he would sacrifice, and then one that would be sent into the wilderness as a scapegoat. And then there was all of these specific instructions for how they were to use the coals and burn incense, and then he would actually make the sacrifice. And when he came out, he had to take another bath, offer 2 more burnt offerings, and then do a few other little things to wrap up the process. It was a huge deal that happened once a year. And essentially, you could say this was the way that people were cleansed from their sin. To say it another way, they were forgiven from their sin. This was part of the system that took people who were separate from God because they were stained and marred with sin and made them clean. And the writer in Hebrews says in verse 22 that it always requires blood. Verse 22 says, "In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." And this can kind of be really weird and gross and gruesome for us. It sounds barbaric because we live in a modern society, but this was the way that the people functioned back then, that it was through these sacrifices. And the reason why it says that blood was required, and blood is all over this chapter, 12, 15 times, somewhere around there, it mentions the idea of bringing blood sacrifices. Because in Leviticus 17, God says to the people in verse 11, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." Essentially saying the life of a person is in their blood. And so when you make a sacrifice that requires blood, essentially what you're doing is exchanging the life of that creature for yours. Saying, I'm exchanging the life of this animal for mine so that I can continue on and live and not be struck dead because I've given something in exchange for my own life. However, even though in this system that was really complex, this system that had its own building dedicated to it, that had a whole order of priests and lots of instruction and requirements for how these sacrifices were to be done and given, the writer also goes on to say that it was insufficient. That even though it was very complex, it was insufficient. He says in verse 9, "This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the consciousness of the worshiper. They're only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of a new order." Meaning that in that system, there was always this big question mark. Like, where am I with God? What's my standing with God like? Am I okay with God? What have I done? Are there things that I've done that I don't know that I've done that I need to atone for? And the writer of Hebrews is saying that system, as complex as it was, and even though it was given to the people by God, was insufficient. It was simply a placeholder for something else that would be better. And that's what he goes on to say next in verse 11. "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus attaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciousness from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant." See, essentially what the writer is saying is that Jesus operates in a whole bunch of different roles. Like if you go back to the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1, the writer will say, now here's the point. Like, here's the main point of what we are saying is that Jesus is a better high priest. Jesus operates as a high priest. And we looked at earlier in the series that priests mediate the relationship between God and the people. Jesus is a better high priest. But also at the same time, Jesus is a better sacrifice. Because as high priest, the sacrifice that he offers is himself. The blood that he offers is his own. And it's only through that sacrifice that we are truly cleaned. All of these other sacrifices, this whole entire system was simply a pointer to Jesus, when he would be the fulfillment of those things, the fulfillment of the high priest, the fulfillment of the sacrifice, even the fulfillment of the temple itself. Because, as our big idea says, it's only Jesus who can make us truly clean. But as this passage goes on, the writer seems to indicate some sort of warnings. And I don't even know if warning is the best word, but it's the best word I could come up with. But he makes 3 warnings that are kind of like 3 contrasts about what it means to be clean and not clean, and how you become clean, and how you need to think about becoming clean. And so I want to give you these 3 contrasts to help us get into this passage even just a little bit further. In the first contrast is an old versus new contrast. See, all throughout the book of Hebrews, the writer is saying that Jesus is bringing something new. Specifically in this passage, it is a new covenant. And all along the way, we've been saying that covenant is simply how God does relationship with people. He makes an arrangement, he makes an agreement, he invites people into this relationship through a covenant, sets expectations, sets boundaries, and says, this is what the relationship is going to be like. In the Old Testament, God makes a relationship, a covenant with his people through Moses. It's known as the Old Covenant. But here, he's saying Jesus is bringing a new covenant. He's bringing a new relationship, a new way to connect with God and be in relationship with him. And what he's saying is that by bringing this new covenant, this new relationship, the old one is obsolete. He says that in chapter 8, verse 13, the old covenant is obsolete. It's useless. It's pointless. It can't do anything anymore. Essentially saying to these Jewish Christians who are thinking about going back to Judaism, he's saying, don't. Why go back? There's nothing there for you. The old way of doing things is ineffective and it's obsolete. Why go back? Because when new things come along that surpass the old things, we pursue those new things. Imagine, for example, you go out and you buy the newest iPhone, right? It just came out this week. The iPhone XR. You could pick it up on Friday this past week. And let's say you go buy a phone, and then you come to me and you're like, Brian, I love my new phone, but I got this problem. I'm like, what is it? Like, I need a way to talk hands-free because every time I put my phone up like this, I get this crick in my neck and it hurts, and now I need to go see a chiropractor because I'm always straining my neck. I need a way to talk on my phone without having to put it like this. And if you come to me and you say, that's my problem, and then I show you this video, you're going to think I'm pretty weird. Take a look at this video.
Is talking on the phone getting out of hand? Look out! You need Phone Relief, the ultimate in hands-free phone design. Watch. Simply attach the special double back fastener to any phone. Then attach the Phone Relief headset. It's that easy. Hands-free, pain-free. You'll wonder how you ever lived without it. It's perfect for remotes. Now talk hands-free anywhere, anytime. Office work is a pain for Mr. Phone in the Neck, but you won't miss a beat with hands-free freedom. A must for the entire office. Work goes quicker and easier. The padded headset removes this easily and is fully adjustable. Best of all, Phone Relief works with your favorite phone. An amazing breakthrough product you'll use every day. Now only $12.95. Call toll-free to order by credit card and make this your last Phone in the Neck call.
Like, if I gave you that solution and you saw me walking around with one of those things strapped to my head, you'd be like, Brian, you're ridiculous. Right, the video says that it's hands-free and pain-free. Ben came up to me in between services. He's like, it's also dignity-free. Like, you have no dignity like wearing that thing at all. And if I offer you that as a solution, you're going to look at me as though I'm crazy. Why? Because technology has advanced so much that those things are obsolete. Now you can get AirPods. Two things that just sit in your ear, no wires attached. You can put your phone on the other side of the room and talk on the phone without even touching your phone, without even it being in your pocket. And so when new things come along, making old things obsolete, we don't look at those old things and be like, yeah, I need to go back to that. We say, no, I'm going forward with the new thing. That's what the writer is saying here, that there's a new way of doing things. There's a new way of connecting with God. A new relationship, a new pathway to God has been opened. Why go back to the old way? There's nothing there for you. The second contrast that he makes is the contrast of things that are copies versus the real thing. A copy versus reality. All throughout chapters 8, 9, and 10, the writer is saying that the old order of things is merely a copy. Some verses will say a shadow of these new things. We read it in chapter 9, verse 23. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with a better sacrifice. Chapter 8, verse 5 says it again. They serve, meaning the priests serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what's in heaven. Saying these things are just pointers to a new reality. They're just copies of a better reality, getting you ready for that better reality. And anytime you have the option between the copy of something that you love and the real thing, you're always going to choose the real thing. Right? For example, if you could have the copy of your favorite painting, maybe it's this classic work of art by an old ancient artist, if you can have the real thing or just a printed copy, and somebody says, take your pick, you can have any one you want. You're going to take the real thing, right? If you're looking for a really nice watch and you want to get a Rolex, and you have the option of like a real Rolex or just a knockoff that has the word Rolex on it, you're going to take the real thing because the real thing is better than a copy of it. Over the summer, our girls got sucked into a TV show on Netflix called Nailed It. Anybody seen this show? Yeah, some of the younger ones are saying they have. It's a baking show, and the title, as you'll see in just a minute, is a bit sarcastic. And the premise of the show is that these amateur bakers who, right, they're just amateurs, they're not professionals, they come to this kitchen and they are tasked with baking and creating beautiful dessert masterpieces. that world-renowned chefs and bakers have created. They have to look at this piece and do their best to copy it. Like, here's an example, right? So maybe it's a little hard to see, but this would be a prehistoric island volcano cake, right? It's a cake. It's a dessert. You can eat it. And there's dinosaurs on it. It's supposed to be like an island. There's a waterfall, and on the top, there is this volcano that on the show actually like smoked and steamed and things came out of it. It was really impressive. And the contestants were tasked to recreate this cake, and they put out things that looked like this. I mean, essentially a pile of trash, right? And they say nailed it sarcastically because they didn't get close to nailing it at all. So think about you, if you're needing to go buy a cake, maybe a wedding cake or something, and you go to a bakery and they show you this, you're like, oh, here's the cake that we want to give you. It's beautiful. It's 3 layers. It's got this beautiful bouquet of flowers on top. It's got ribbons and bows and prints and things. And you can have this, or you can have the copy that one of our amateur bakers made, being this, right? My kids could make something better than that. That's an actual cake that came from the show. You are going to choose the real thing every time, because the real thing is far superior than the knockoff copy. And so what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that this old order, it's just a shadow. It's just a copy. Essentially, you could say it's just a placeholder for something better. And what he's saying is that that real thing is actually here. Verse 11, but when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here. Seeing the good things, the real thing, the real reality that these copies were pointing towards is here. And Jesus in John 2, during his earthly ministry, he's in Jerusalem. He's teaching in the temple. And he starts to specifically say that the temple is just a copy, it's just a placeholder for himself. And he starts to speak to the religious leaders saying, go ahead, destroy this temple, knock it down. I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they say to him, you have to be out of your mind. It took 46 years to build this thing. How are you going to rebuild it in 3 days? See, the temple, again, for the Israelites was the most significant location in all of Israel because it was believed that God's presence dwelled in the temple. It dwelled in the most holy place that only the high priest could go once a year. To say it another way, it was believed to be this place where heaven and earth begin to intersect and overlap. That's where God's presence lived. And Jesus comes on the scene saying, no, that thing is obsolete because that thing is just a pointer to me. It's in me where God's presence fully dwells. It's in me where heaven and earth begin to overlap. And then as his ministry goes on, as he ascends back to the Father, he sends his Spirit, and essentially he says, and now it's in you. You have the Spirit of God in you. The presence of God resides in you. You become a place where heaven and earth begin to overlap. If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. You are a walking, breathing, speaking, working glimpse of the heavenly things. The New Testament says that we now are the temple. Our bodies are the place where God's Spirit resides. So don't go after copies of things. Like, you become part of that real thing. Embrace it, know it, believe it, step into it. Because the old order of things has passed away. The old order of things has become obsolete because Jesus has come. He has been raised from the dead. He has sent his Spirit. He has made you clean. Pursue him and him alone. Contrast 1, old versus new. Contrast 2, copies versus the real thing. Contrast 3 is external versus internal. See, the writer of Hebrews is saying that the old system couldn't cleanse the conscience of the worshiper. He says that in verse 9. Verse 10, he goes on to say, those sacrifices are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations, applying until the time of the new order. He says again in verse 13 that the old order could only clean people outwardly, it couldn't clean people inwardly. And Jesus comes and says, I'm making you clean through and through, in and out. To the deepest part of your being, I am making you whole. But we're really good at pretending and projecting. Even though Jesus comes to make us clean, we don't always believe that. Because if we did, we'd be a whole lot more honest about the sin that lies internally, because that no longer defines us. And Jesus in his earthly ministry goes after the Pharisees for this really hard. It maybe becomes his biggest critique of their ministry. He goes on to say that externally, you look great. Internally, you're wasting away. He says in Matthew 23:25, "Woe to you, Pharisees! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside, you're full of selfishness, indulgence, and greed." In other parts in the Gospels, he'll say, "You are whitewashed tombs. You look really good on the outside, but inside, you're wasting away." A few weeks ago, I was making lunch for my kids, and we had this thing of strawberries in our fridge, and I was cutting up strawberries to put on their plate, and I came across this one that looked beautiful, and I was tempted just to pop it in my mouth. And I don't know why I didn't, but I'm glad I didn't, because when I cut it open, inside it was black, and there was a worm living in there. And just the idea of it made me throw up in my mouth a little bit, oh, I was just about to put that thing in my mouth, right? On the outside, it looked beautiful. I mean, it was like the best strawberry you'd ever seen, but as soon as I sliced it open, there was this living thing poking his head out hey, how's it going? And we can live that way ourselves. If we're honest with ourselves, instead of stepping into the freedom that we have in Jesus, because he has made us clean, and confess our sins and be honest about our shortcomings, we push them down, we suppress them, and we hide. Because what we truly believe is that we have to be the ones to project an image of strength. We have to be the ones who hold ourselves together. We have to be the ones who manage our behavior such that people don't see us in our weakness. People don't see us when we're struggling. That people don't see us in our sin. And maybe you don't resonate so much with the idea of an old order of things passing away, because in your spiritual journey, you've never really seen an old religious system that seems lifeless, and now you're stepping into something new and you're tempted to go back to that thing. But I got to believe there's lots of people here who do resonate with the idea of internally hiding something and projecting something opposite in their life. And the reason I know that is because I hear your stories. It's not uncommon for somebody to come up to me in a panic at times and say, "Brian, I got to meet. Can we sit down? Can we talk?" I'm like, "Sure, anytime." And then we sit down and they say, "Okay, here's my thing." And boom, they lay it out. And I'm like, "Oh, wow. I didn't see that was coming." Right? Because on the external, they're projecting like they got it all together, that life is successful for them, that they're doing great in their spiritual journey. But as soon as you sit down and they really open up, it's like, oh, it's not the way it appears. But in that moment, that's how you truly step into freedom. Right? Verse 15, that Christ is the mediator of the new covenant. Those who are called receive this promise, this eternal inheritance. And he says, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins they committed. The way you step into true freedom is through confession, believing all the while that what Jesus says about you is true. Not believing that I have to micromanage other people's perceptions of myself. And so the writer gives these three contrasts: old versus new, copies versus reality, and external versus internal, saying that you have been cleaned through and through because of Jesus and nothing else, because only Jesus makes us truly clean. And essentially, I think the challenge of this passage, point number 3, is to actually believe that that's true. To actually believe that is who you are. This is the way that the passage finishes in verse 23. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of this world. But he appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. See, essentially you could say there's one more contrast. It's the contrast of repeated sacrifices. That the high priest has to enter the holy place year after year, again and again, make sacrifice after sacrifice, but Jesus does it once for all. He does it one time, and only one time. I think many of us are trying repeatedly, again and again, I got to find a way to close the gap on my sin and this righteousness that I'm supposed to be living by. I got to find a way to do this, and you find yourself in this cycle of again and again trying to work your own way out of the sin that keeps you down. But God is saying, no, Jesus has already done that for you. He did it once, and you never have to go back and try it again. So all you have to do in the meantime is get honest and be real about where you're struggling. Name it, call it what it is, because then and only then will you be set free to the life that Jesus offers you. When you confess things out loud, they lose the power they hold in your life, and then you have the ability to walk in newness of life. And the description that we're given in this book and in other parts of the New Testament about who we are is mind-blowing. Right, he says in chapter 10, still talking about the temple and what the temple does versus what Jesus does, 10 verse 10 says, and by that will, we, the will being what Jesus has done on the cross, we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus once for all. We have been made holy. My guess is there's a lot of days where you don't feel holy. My guess there's a lot of moments where you feel anything but holy. But the challenge of this passage, the challenge of the New Testament, is to believe that reality even when you don't feel it. I mean, Paul says the same thing in Colossians 1. He says, once you were enemies of God, alienated from Christ because of your evil behavior, but now you have been reconciled to God through Christ, and you have been made pure. You have been made holy. You have been made holy without blemish and free of accusation. This is who you are. Even when you don't live that way, that's the way that God sees you. So you don't have to pretend anymore. You just have to believe that reality. And when you start to step into that, when you say, hey, I'm not going to let my sin define me or hold me down or try and suppress it. I'm just going to be open and honest about it. And I'm not saying you go around and tell everybody your deepest, darkest secrets, but you find a way to confess the things that lie deep within. They lose power on you. And then you can step into the freedom that Jesus offers. This holy, righteous, unblemished, free from accusation. Because that's who you are. And sometimes we're hesitant to believe it. Because we think, oh, there's no way that could be true. The scandalous nature of the cross is that it is. That even when you don't feel it, even when it's hard to believe, the way that God sees you is holy, spotless, righteous, and pure. And it's only through Jesus, because it's only Jesus who does that for you. It's only Jesus, once and for all, who makes you clean. So the way that we're going to respond this morning is we're going to go before the Lord's table. And in this meal, this simple meal of bread and the cup, we have another copy. We have a shadow, a pointer to a greater reality. The body of Jesus being represented by the bread, the blood of Jesus being represented by the cup, taking and eating the bread and the cup to symbolize the way that we have been united with Christ in his death, but it also means that we have been united with Christ in his resurrection to new life. And so this meal is set before us, intending to be a meal for the family of God. Those who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ, this meal is set for you. One, it's set as a reminder a reminder for what God has done in your own life to set you free. 2, it's an opportunity to reflect and to ask the question, where am I hiding? Where am I not living into the reality that God has given me? Where are the places in my life that I'm still holding back and haven't fully surrendered from God? But 3, it also stands as a moment to repent, to turn, to go back to Jesus, to go to the foot of the cross, to lay your sin down and say, Jesus, here it is. I'm giving more and more fully myself to you. But it also stands as an invitation to those who aren't a part of the family of God, an invitation to come and be a part. It's for those who are tired of living a life of hiding. It's for those who are tired of projecting because you know that you can't keep it up. It's a meal for those who are plagued by their guilty conscience, wanting their guilt to be washed away. And Jesus says, I will do that and have done that for you. But it's a meal that's costly. 1, it's costly for Jesus because it cost him his life. But 2, it's also costly for us because it costs you everything. Meaning by saying I'm a follower of Jesus, you're declaring and proclaiming that all my chips are in on this. I'm not holding anything back. But I'm going all in because I have no other hope. I have no other way of being clean apart from Jesus, so I am putting all of my eggs in that basket. I'm going all in. And so we invite you to come forward this morning knowing that it comes with great sacrifice, great commitment, and great cost, but also knowing that in the same way, Jesus is better than anything you could ever experience in this world. So it's so worth it. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this meal, for all that it symbolizes and represents. We ask that in this moment our hearts would be open to you, that we would be able to fully surrender our entire lives, or that we would not see this as a religious ritual to somehow appease you, but we would see it as a joyful expression of what you have done for us. And so, Lord, we remember the words on the night that you were betrayed, when at the evening meal with your disciples, you took the bread and you gave thanks and you broke it and you said, this is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And on that same evening, you took the cup after the meal and you said, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. For every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. May this meal be a proclamation of your life, your death, your renewal of all things through your sacrifice made for us. Pray this in your name. Amen.